Paris, February 13th, 1917. The French government was desperate to crack down on espionage in the midst of World War I, but one individual would become the focal point of their obsession. On this day, Mata Hari, exotic dancer, courtesan, and suspected spy, was arrested by French authorities. Despite her fame and high-profile relationships with military officers on both sides of the war, the evidence against her was circumstantial at best. Yet the French authorities would have her executed for treason, not based on hard facts, but because of the paranoia that gripped the nation. Was Mata Hari truly the treacherous spy that the French military claimed? Or was she merely a convenient scapegoat in a time of escalating conflict? This trial would serve as the backdrop for one of the most controversial espionage cases in history, cementing her as a symbol of wartime hysteria and myth. Leeuwarden, Netherlands, 1876. Margaretha Zelle was born into prosperity. Her father, Adam Zelle, was a successful hat merchant who indulged his daughter with luxuries uncommon for the era. She attended a private school and wore fine clothes. The household employed servants. For the young Margaretha, the world seemed secure and predictable. Then the stability collapsed. Adam Zelle's business ventures failed, bankruptcy followed, the family fractured. By the time Margaretha reached her teenage years, her mother had died and her father had abandoned the family. She was sent to live with relatives, her education interrupted, her prospects dimmed. At 18, she answered a newspaper advertisement. A colonial officer stationed in the Dutch East Indies sought a wife. Captain Rudolph MacLeod was 21 years her senior. The marriage took place in 1895. Within months, they departed for Java. The colonial experience proved brutal. MacLeod drank heavily and became violent. Margaretha, isolated in a foreign land, sought companionship elsewhere. 2 children were born. Their son died young, poisoned by a servant seeking revenge against MacLeod. The marriage disintegrated. By 1900, they had returned to the Netherlands. Divorce followed in 1902. Margaretha Zelle, now a divorced woman with limited means and a young daughter she could barely support, faced a society that offered few options. She made a calculated decision. She would go to Paris. She would reinvent herself completely. In 1905, she emerged on the Parisian stage as Mata Hari. The name meant Eye of the Dawn in Malay. She claimed to be a Javanese princess trained in sacred temple dances. She performed in exotic costumes that grew progressively more revealing. Audiences, hungry for Oriental mystique, believed the fabrication entirely. The expectation was that she would fade quickly, another novelty act in a city crowded with performers. The reality proved different. Mata Hari captivated Paris. Her performances sold out. Wealthy men competed for her attention. She became a courtesan to military officers, politicians, and aristocrats. By 1914, she was famous across Europe, yet beneath the glamour lay persistent financial instability. Her expensive lifestyle consumed everything she earned. She moved constantly, always one step ahead of creditors. When war erupted across Europe in August 1914, Mata Hari's world of wealthy patrons and carefree travel began to crumble. In the years that followed, her connections to powerful men on both sides of the conflict would transform from assets into fatal liabilities. June 28, 1914, Sarajevo, Bosnia, Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria was assassinated. Within weeks, the elaborate system of European alliances activated. Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia. Russia mobilized in support of Serbia. Germany declared war on Russia, then on France. Britain entered when Germany violated Belgian neutrality. By August, the continent was engulfed in conflict. The war transformed everything. Borders closed, travel became restricted, military intelligence services expanded rapidly. Both the Allies and the Central Powers established extensive spy networks. Information became as valuable as ammunition. France faced a particularly urgent intelligence crisis. German forces had advanced rapidly in the opening months of the war. By September 1914, German troops stood just 30 miles from Paris. The French military command, caught off guard by the speed and coordination of German movements, recognized a critical deficiency in reconnaissance and intelligence gathering. The 12e Bureau, France's military intelligence service, expanded aggressively. Agents were recruited from unconventional backgrounds. Prostitutes, hotel staff, and entertainers who might gain access to enemy officers became valuable assets. The Bureau opened dozens of case files. Surveillance expanded. Intercepted correspondence multiplied. Mata Hari continued performing in the neutral Netherlands throughout 1914 and 1915. Her connections to wealthy German officers raised no immediate concerns. Many performers maintained relationships across enemy lines. Entertainment was supposed to be neutral ground, but by 1916, the French intelligence apparatus had grown increasingly paranoid. The war had settled into brutal stalemate. The Battle of Verdun which began in February 1916, would eventually claim over 700,000 casualties. The Battle of the Somme, launched in July, would kill or wound more than 1 million men. In this atmosphere of mass slaughter and frustrated ambitions, intelligence failures demanded scapegoats. The expectation had been that superior French military tradition would ensure swift victory. The reality was unending bloodshed and strategic paralysis. Someone had to be responsible for the German advantages. Spies became the explanation, and Mata Hari, with her German lovers and international lifestyle, became an obvious target for suspicion. By late 1916, French intelligence had opened a file on her. The case number was H21, Paris, 1916. Captain Georges Ladoux commanded a section of the 12e Bureau responsible for counter-espionage. He was ambitious, methodical, and deeply concerned about German intelligence penetration. Ladoux reviewed hundreds of suspect files. Mata Hari's caught his attention. The file documented her relationships. She had been the mistress of German officers in Berlin before the war. She had traveled frequently between France, the Netherlands, and Germany. She lived beyond her apparent means. Bank records showed irregular deposits. Her correspondence included letters to and from military personnel. In December 1915, British intelligence had detained Mata Hari at Falmouth, England, during a routine security check. They suspected she might be Clara Benedix, a known German spy. After questioning, they determined she was not Benedix and released her. But the incident was documented. The British shared the report with French intelligence. Ladoux ordered surveillance. French agents followed Mata Hari through Paris. They noted her visits to cafes, theaters, and hotels. They recorded which military officers she met. They opened her mail. One intercepted letter, addressed to a German officer, mentioned certain arrangements. The phrase was vague but suggestive. In May 1916, Mata Hari visited Ladoux at his office. The meeting was cordial. She needed money and proposed working for French intelligence. She offered to use her connections with German officers to gather information. Ladoux appeared interested. He asked questions about her German contacts. She answered freely. He did not hire her. What Mata Hari did not know was that Ladoux now considered her either a German agent attempting infiltration or a potentially useful double agent. He ordered continued surveillance. French intelligence began building a case. In November 1916, Mata Hari traveled to Madrid. She became involved with a German military attaché, Major Arnold Kaller. French intelligence intercepted German radio communications between Berlin and Madrid. The messages, which used a code the French had already broken, referenced Agent H21. They described meetings with a woman providing information about French military dispositions. The expectation among French intelligence officers was that they had uncovered a dangerous German spy network. The reality was more ambiguous. The intercepted messages were suspiciously easy to decode. Some historians would later suggest that German intelligence deliberately used the compromised code to feed false information or to sacrifice an agent they considered unreliable. But in early 1917, with France locked in total war and casualty lists growing daily, such subtleties did not matter. Captain Ladoux had his case. On February 13, 1917, French police arrested Mata Hari at the Hotel Élysée Palace in Paris. She was charged with espionage. The trial that would define her legacy was about to begin. Paris, 1917. The myth of the femme fatale spy had deep roots in European culture. By World War I, popular fiction and newspapers regularly featured stories of beautiful women who seduced military officers and extracted vital secrets. The archetype resonated powerfully in a society where traditional gender roles were being disrupted by total war. French propaganda actively promoted fear of female spies. Posters warned soldiers against speaking to attractive women. Military briefings emphasized the danger of romantic entanglements. The message was clear: beautiful women were potential weapons deployed by the enemy. Mata Hari fit the archetype perfectly. She was exotic, sexually liberated, and connected to powerful men across Europe. The French press, even before her arrest, had published suggestive articles about her German relationships. When news of her arrest broke, newspapers immediately cast her as the ultimate seductress spy. But the actual evidence told a different story. French intelligence had documented her relationships with military officers, French, German, Russian, and British. Yet the file contained no concrete proof that she had passed specific military information to the Germans. The intercepted communications from Madrid mentioned Agent H21, but provided no details about what information had allegedly been transmitted. Captain Ladoux interrogated her repeatedly at Saint-Lazare prison. Mata Hari admitted to accepting money from German officers. She claimed it was payment for her company, not for espionage. She acknowledged meeting with Major Cale in Madrid, but insisted she had tried to extract information from him for France, not provide it to Germany. The interrogation records show a woman who was neither sophisticated spy nor innocent victim. She had taken money from multiple sources, she had lied about her background and identity for years, but she appeared genuinely confused about the specific accusations against her. When Ledoux demanded details about her espionage activities, she could provide none. The expectation was that a skilled German agent would have been trained in tradecraft, codes, and communication protocols. The reality was a woman whose main talent was self-invention and whose primary commodity was access to wealthy men. French intelligence possessed no evidence of formal spy training, no coded messages in her handwriting, no dead drops or handlers, or any of the infrastructure that characterized actual espionage networks of the period. Yet the myth proved more powerful than the facts. By April 1917, when Mata Hari's case went to trial, French newspapers had thoroughly convicted her in the public imagination. She was the seductress who had betrayed France. Whether or not the evidence supported the charge became secondary to the symbolic necessity of her guilt. Paris, July 24, 1917. The trial of Mata Hari began at the Troisième Conseil de Guerre, a military court. 7 officers served as judges. The proceedings were closed to the public, ostensibly for reasons of military security. No verbatim transcript was kept. What remains are summary notes and later reconstructions. The prosecution, led by Lieutenant André Mornay, presented its case over 2 days. Mornay argued that Mata Hari was Agent H-21, a German spy responsible for transmitting French military secrets that had cost the lives of thousands of soldiers. He cited the intercepted German communications from Madrid. He described her relationships with German officers. He emphasized the money she had received, but the specific evidence remained vague. Mornay could not identify what particular military information Mata Hari had allegedly provided to Germany. He could not demonstrate how she had obtained classified material. He could not produce a single German officer or handler who would testify to directing her activities. The defense, led by Edouard Clunet, attempted to counter the prosecution's narrative. Clunet, who was 74 years old and had been Mata Hari's lover, argued that his client was innocent of espionage. He pointed out that she had openly approached French intelligence, offering to work for them. He emphasized that she had traveled freely and openly, using her real name and maintaining her famous public identity. Hardly the behavior of a trained spy. Clunet called several witnesses who testified to Mata Hari's character. None could provide evidence of espionage activities. The defense argued that the German communications might refer to a different agent, or that German intelligence might have fabricated the traffic to protect actual spies by directing suspicion toward a well-known figure. The prosecution called military officers who had been involved with Mata Hari. Their testimony was damaging but inconsistent. Some claimed she had asked suspicious questions about military matters. Others said she had shown no unusual interest in such topics. One officer testified that she had mentioned troop movements in casual conversation. Another stated he had never discussed military affairs with her at all. Captain Ledoux testified about the intercepted German communications. He presented the decrypted messages as definitive proof of Mata Hari's guilt. But under questioning, he acknowledged that the code used was one the Germans knew had been compromised. He could not explain why Germany would use a broken code for communication with an important agent. The trial concluded on July 25th. The 7 judges deliberated. The expectation, given the weakness of the evidence, was that some judges might vote for acquittal, or at least recommend clemency. The reality was unanimous. Conviction on all charges. Mata Hari was found guilty of espionage and sentenced to death by firing squad. Years later, in 1932, Lieutenant Mornay, by then a prominent judge, gave an interview. He was asked about the Mata Hari case. He stated, "There was not enough evidence to flog a cat." Yet in 1917, that evidence had been sufficient to execute a woman. Following the verdict, Mata Hari remained imprisoned at Saint-Lazare. Her lawyer filed appeals. The requests for clemency reached President Raymond Poincaré. All appeals were denied. The execution was scheduled for October 15, 1917. The French government had reasons beyond the evidence for pursuing execution. By October 1917, France was in crisis. The Nivelle offensive of April and May had been a catastrophic failure, resulting in over 180,000 French casualties. Mutinies had spread through the French army. Dozens of soldiers had been executed for refusing orders. Morale was dangerously low. In this context, Mata Hari served a propaganda purpose. Her execution demonstrated that France was rooting out the spies who had supposedly undermined military operations. It provided a tangible enemy for public anger. It suggested that French military failures could be explained by treachery rather than strategic incompetence. The execution took place at Vincennes military barracks. 12 soldiers formed the firing squad. A captain and a medical officer attended. Mata Hari declined a blindfold. According to official records, she faced the rifles calmly. Her final words were reported as, "Hurry up, you're wasting my time." Some witnesses disputed this account, but it became part of her legend. The execution was announced publicly. French newspapers declared that a dangerous German spy had been eliminated. Allied press repeated the story. The narrative of Mata Hari as master spy became official history, but public reaction was mixed. Some praised the execution as necessary justice, others expressed doubt about the evidence. Letters appeared in newspapers questioning whether Mata Hari had actually been guilty. Several prominent figures, including the writer Colette, suggested that she had been scapegoated. No one claimed Mata Hari's body. Under French law at the time, the bodies of executed criminals could be used for medical research if not claimed by family. Mata Hari's corpse was sent to the Museum of Anatomy in Paris. Her head was later preserved and displayed. The museum eventually lost track of both the body and the preserved head during relocations in the 20th century. Within months of the execution, the mythology expanded. Books appeared claiming to reveal the truth about Mata Hari's espionage network. Most were fabrications. Films dramatized her story, inventing elaborate spy plots. The real woman, Margaretha Zelle, who had reinvented herself as Mata Hari to escape poverty and scandal, disappeared beneath layers of fiction. In the years that followed, she would become a symbol of wartime hysteria and the intersection of sexuality, fear, and power. Saint-Lazare Prison, Paris, February through July 1917. The interrogations followed a pattern. Captain Ledoux would arrive with files and photographs. He would confront Mata Hari with evidence of her movements, her relationships, her finances. She would explain. He would press for details. The sessions sometimes lasted for hours. The prison conditions were harsh. Mata Hari occupied a small cell. She received minimal food. The winter was cold. She wrote letters pleading for better treatment, for warm clothes, for more food. Some letters reached her lawyer. Most disappeared into the prison bureaucracy. During interrogation, Ledoux employed standard techniques. He showed knowledge of details to create the impression that he knew everything. He offered leniency in exchange for confession. He suggested that cooperation would result in a lighter sentence. Mata Hari consistently denied being a spy. She admitted facts that seemed damaging. Yes, she had accepted 20,000 francs from a German officer in Berlin before the war. Yes, she had met with Major Kaller in Madrid. Yes, she had discussed military matters with various officers, but she maintained that these actions did not constitute espionage. The most damaging admission involved her meeting with Kaller. She acknowledged that Kaller had given her money. She claimed she had been attempting to extract information from him to provide to French intelligence, fulfilling her offer to work for France. Ledoux dismissed this explanation. He argued that she had been working for Germany all along and that her approach to French intelligence had been a cover. The expectation was that intensive interrogation would break her and produce a detailed confession. The reality was that after months of questioning, French intelligence had extracted only admissions that could be interpreted as either naive indiscretion or sophisticated tradecraft, depending on the investigator's assumptions. Modern analysis of the interrogation records reveals no evidence of torture, but significant psychological pressure. Mata Hari was isolated, denied adequate defense preparation time, and repeatedly told that her execution was inevitable unless she confessed. The tactics were legal by the standards of 1917 military justice, but would later be criticized as coercive. By July, when the trial commenced, Mata Hari had been interrogated dozens of times. She had provided extensive testimony about her life, relationships, and finances, but she had not confessed to espionage. The case against her would rest not on her own words, but on the interpretation of her actions and the intercepted German communications. Vincennes, October 15, 1917. Dawn broke cold and grey. Mata Hari was awakened at 5 o'clock in the morning. She was given coffee. A Catholic priest offered last rites. She declined. She dressed carefully in a dark coat and hat. At 5:45, she was escorted from her cell. The execution ground was a section of the military barracks used for this purpose. A wooden post stood in a clearing. 12 soldiers of the 4th Zouave Regiment formed the firing squad. They were not volunteers. Execution duty was assigned by rotation. Most were young men who had seen extensive combat at Verdun or the Somme. Military protocol required specific procedures. The condemned was offered a final statement. Mata Hari declined. She was offered a blindfold. She refused. She stood against the post without being bound. This detail was noted in the official report and contributed to the legend of her composure. At 6 o'clock precisely, the commanding officer gave the order. The 12 rifles fired simultaneously. Standard practice was for half the rifles to contain live ammunition and half to contain blanks. so that no individual soldier could know with certainty whether his weapon had fired a fatal shot. This psychological consideration was intended to reduce trauma among the executioners. Mata Hari fell. The medical officer approached and confirmed death. The time was recorded as 6:02. The execution had proceeded according to regulation. The firing squad was dismissed. The body was prepared for removal. Within hours, the French government issued an official announcement. A German spy had been executed. Justice had been served. The statement provided no details about the evidence or the trial. Foreign newspapers picked up the story. By the next day, Mata Hari's execution was reported across Europe and in the United States. The expectation was that the execution would be remembered as a necessary wartime security measure. The reality was that it immediately provoked controversy and would continue to do so for more than a century. Questions about the evidence, the fairness of the trial, and the motivations of French intelligence began appearing in newspapers within weeks. The execution also demonstrated the broader pattern of wartime justice. Between 1914 and 1918, all major combatant nations executed individuals for espionage. Many cases involved similarly thin evidence, hurried trials, and executions carried out before appeals could be properly heard. Mata Hari was not unique in being executed on questionable evidence. She was unique in becoming famous for it. Paris, 1920s and 1930s. The immediate post-war period saw the beginning of historical reassessment. Journalists and researchers began requesting access to the Mata Hari files. The French government initially refused all requests, citing national security. But gradually, pieces of information emerged. In 1932, as mentioned earlier, prosecutor André Mornay gave his interview acknowledging the weakness of the evidence. His admission shocked the public. If the chief prosecutor believed the case was insufficient, why had execution been pursued? Historians began examining the context of 1917. The Nivelle offensive had failed catastrophically. The French army had mutinied. Russia had collapsed into revolution, removing a crucial ally from the war. The United States had entered the conflict but had not yet fielded significant forces. France was desperate for any positive propaganda. In this context, executing a famous spy served multiple purposes. It demonstrated vigilance against espionage. It provided an explanation for military failures that did not blame French commanders. It offered the public a villain at a time when morale required enemies within as well as without. Researchers also examined the intercepted German communications more carefully. The messages that supposedly proved Mata Hari was Agent H-21 had been sent using a code that German intelligence knew had been broken by the Allies. This raised serious questions. Why would Germany use compromised communications to contact an important agent? Several theories emerged. One possibility was that German intelligence was deliberately feeding false information to French intelligence, hoping to create confusion. Another was that the Germans were sacrificing Mata Hari, whom they considered unreliable, to protect more valuable agents. A third theory suggested that the communications might have referred to a different agent entirely, and that French intelligence had misidentified H-21 as Mata Hari. Documents released in later decades provided additional context. Files from the 1950s revealed that French intelligence had been tracking multiple suspected spies simultaneously. Several were arrested, interrogated, and released due to insufficient evidence. Mata Hari's fame and symbolic value apparently made her a more attractive prosecution target than obscure suspects who might have actually been engaged in espionage. The expectation had been that further research would definitively prove or disprove Mata Hari's guilt. The reality was that decades of investigation produced no smoking gun in either direction. The evidence remained circumstantial, the testimony inconsistent, and the motivations of all parties obscure. What became clear was that the trial had been driven as much by wartime necessity as by facts. Hollywood, 1931. Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer released a film titled Mata Hari, starring Greta Garbo. The movie bore little resemblance to historical fact. It portrayed Mata Hari as a glamorous spy who sacrificed herself for love. The film was enormously successful and established the template for how popular culture would remember her. Over the following decades, Mata Hari appeared in dozens of films, novels, plays, and television shows. Each adaptation added new fictional elements. Some portrayed her as a tragic victim. Others emphasized her supposed espionage skills. Nearly all focused on her sexuality and exotic persona, rather than the historical facts of her life and trial. The mythological Mata Hari became a cultural archetype. The beautiful spy who uses seduction as a weapon. This image influenced everything from pulp novels to Cold War propaganda. Female intelligence operatives, real and fictional, were compared to her. The term Mata Hari entered multiple languages as a generic descriptor for seductive spies, but the mythology obscured the historical reality. Margaretha Zelle had been a struggling performer who invented an exotic persona to escape poverty. She had relationships with wealthy men because that was one of the few paths available to women of limited means in early 20th century Europe. Her fame made her visible, and her visibility made her vulnerable when intelligence services needed scapegoats. Academic historians gradually developed a more nuanced understanding. Biographies published in the 1980s and 1990s, drawing on newly accessible archival material, portrayed Mata Hari as neither master spy nor innocent martyr, but as an opportunistic woman who made calculated choices in desperate circumstances. She had taken money from German officers. She had probably provided some information, though likely nothing of significant military value. She had certainly lied about many aspects of her life. The case also became important in the history of espionage law and military justice. Legal scholars analyzing the trial identified numerous procedural problems: the closed proceedings, the lack of physical evidence, the reliance on intercepted communications that might have been deliberately fabricated, and the denial of adequate time for defense preparation. These critiques influenced international conventions on the treatment of suspected spies. The Geneva Conventions adopted after World War II included provisions requiring fair trials and proper evidence for espionage charges. The Mata Hari case was specifically cited in debates over these provisions. The expectation was that historical distance would allow for objective assessment. The reality was that Mata Hari remained a contested figure, interpreted differently depending on the concerns of each era. Feminists saw her as a victim of patriarchal power structures. Intelligence historians debated her actual activities. Cultural critics analyzed how her story revealed societal anxieties about female sexuality and power. The historical Margaretha Zelle continued to disappear beneath the accumulated layers of interpretation. London, October 1915. Edith Cavell, a British nurse, was executed by German forces in Belgium. She had been convicted of helping Allied soldiers escape to neutral territory. The execution provoked international outrage and became a major propaganda tool for the Allies. Yet, 2 years later, those same Allied powers would execute Mata Hari under circumstances that raised similar questions about evidence and fairness. The parallel was not lost on observers at the time. Both Cavell and Mata Hari were women whose executions served propaganda purposes that transcended their actual activities. World War I saw unprecedented use of military tribunals and espionage charges. All major combatant nations established extensive intelligence services and counterintelligence operations. Thousands of individuals were investigated for espionage. Hundreds were tried and executed. Germany executed multiple Allied spies during the war. Britain executed several German agents. France, in addition to Mata Hari, executed more than a dozen other suspected spies. Russia executed numerous individuals on espionage charges. Though record-keeping became unreliable after the 1917 revolution, the United States executed at least 6 German agents during its brief involvement in the conflict. Many of these cases shared common features with the Mata Hari trial: closed proceedings, limited defense rights, heavy reliance on intercepted communications, and execution carried out quickly after conviction. The wartime context created pressure for swift justice. National security concerns overrode normal procedural protections. The pattern revealed how total war transformed legal systems. When nations mobilize entire populations for conflict, the distinction between military and civilian justice blurs. Security concerns expand to justify extraordinary measures. Individuals become symbols to be manipulated for propaganda purposes. In the post-war period, many nations eventually acknowledged that wartime justice had produced unjust outcomes. Britain pardoned several individuals executed for cowardice or desertion during the war, recognizing that many had suffered from what we now understand as combat stress or post-traumatic stress disorder. France similarly reconsidered some wartime convictions. But no pardon was ever issued for Mata Hari. Her case remained officially closed. The verdict stood. This intransigence reflected the French government's investment in the narrative. To admit error would require acknowledging that wartime intelligence and military justice had been compromised by propaganda needs and public hysteria. The broader legacy is a cautionary tale about how societies under stress abandon principles of evidence and fair procedure. The Mata Hari case demonstrated that famous individuals could be prosecuted not primarily for their actions, but for their symbolic value. This pattern would repeat in later conflicts, as nations continued to find that high-profile trials served propaganda purposes regardless of underlying facts. Langley, Virginia, 21st century. The Central Intelligence Agency maintains an internal museum and historical archive. Among the case studies used in training courses for intelligence analysts is a module on the Mata Hari case. It serves as an example of multiple intelligence failures: confirmation bias, over-reliance on intercepted communications without corroborating evidence, and the distortion of analysis by propaganda needs. Modern intelligence professionals recognize that the Mata Hari case illustrates fundamental problems in espionage work. The French intelligence service in 1917 assumed that a woman with connections to enemy officers must be a spy. This assumption reflected cultural stereotypes rather than analytical rigor. When evidence failed to support the assumption, the service shaped its interpretation to fit the preconception rather than questioning the premise. Contemporary intelligence analysis emphasizes the importance of distinguishing between different levels of evidence. Circumstantial evidence, such as Mata Hari's relationships and financial arrangements, may justify investigation but should not alone support conviction. Direct evidence of actual intelligence transmission is required. The Mata Hari case had only circumstantial evidence, yet proceeded to execution. The case also illustrates the danger of mirror imaging in intelligence work. French officers assumed that German intelligence operated like their own service. They assumed that intercepted communications reflected actual intelligence priorities. They failed to consider that the Germans might be engaging in deception or disinformation. Modern training emphasizes questioning such assumptions. Perhaps most importantly, the Mata Hari case serves as a warning about the intersection of intelligence and politics. In 1917, French intelligence needed a high-profile spy conviction for propaganda purposes. This need influenced their analysis and prosecution. Modern intelligence agencies recognize this danger but continue to face similar pressures when political leaders demand results that support particular narratives. The expectation was that professional intelligence services would learn from historical mistakes and develop more rigorous analytical standards. The reality is that similar errors continue to occur. Confirmation bias, cultural stereotyping, and political pressure remain constant challenges. The Mata Hari case endures as a reminder that these problems are not easily solved by better training or more sophisticated technology. Paris, present day. The Museum of Anatomy no longer exists. The building was demolished in the mid-20th century when researchers attempted to locate Mata Hari's preserved remains for proper burial. They discovered that all records had been lost. The body that had been sent for anatomical study disappeared. The preserved head that had briefly been displayed vanished during one of the museum's relocations. There is no grave to visit. No memorial marks her execution at Vincennes. The apartment where she lived in Paris has been demolished and rebuilt. The Hotel Élysée Palace, where she was arrested, no longer stands. The physical traces of Margaretha Zelle have been erased as thoroughly as her actual identity was obscured by the persona of Mata Hari. What remains is the mythology and the questions. Was she a spy? Almost certainly not a significant one. Did she pass information to German officers? Possibly, though nothing of apparent military value. Was her trial fair? By any modern standard of justice, clearly not. Was her execution justified by the evidence presented? Even her prosecutor later admitted it was not. The Mata Hari case stands as a monument to several intersecting phenomena of the early 20th century: the total mobilization of society for war, the expansion of state surveillance and intelligence services, the power of propaganda to shape public perception, and the vulnerability of individuals who become symbols in conflicts larger than themselves. In the history of espionage, few figures have left a legacy as complex and debated as Mata Hari. A symbol of wartime paranoia and the perils of intelligence, her story remains a stark reminder of the costs of both myth and reality. Her trial demonstrated how legal proceedings could be distorted by propaganda needs. Her execution illustrated how individuals could be sacrificed to serve national narratives. Her posthumous fame revealed how thoroughly fiction could overwhelm fact. The questions that drove her prosecution: did she betray military secrets? Did she cause the deaths of soldiers? Was she working for Germany? Have never been definitively answered. The evidence remains circumstantial and contradictory, but perhaps those questions are less important than the deeper issues her case raises about justice, evidence, and the treatment of individuals during times of national crisis. Modern societies claim to have learned from such mistakes. Legal systems now provide stronger procedural protections. Intelligence services profess greater analytical rigor. International conventions establish minimum standards for trials of suspected spies. Yet the patterns persist. Nations under stress continue to prosecute individuals based on thin evidence. High-profile cases continue to be shaped by propaganda needs as much as facts. The myth continues to prove more powerful than reality. Margaretha Zelle died at 51 years old, executed by the country she had tried to serve and claim as home. She left behind a daughter who refused to acknowledge her, friends who quickly distanced themselves, and a reputation that ensured she would be remembered but never understood. In the archives and museums of Europe, fragments of her actual story survive, waiting for researchers willing to separate fact from the accumulated fiction. But for most people, Mata Hari remains what she became in 1917, a symbol whose meaning shifts with each generation that encounters her story. The lesson, if there is one, lies not in determining her guilt or innocence, but in recognizing how easily truth becomes casualty during war, not just on battlefields, but in courtrooms, in intelligence assessments, in public discourse. The case of Mata Hari stands as a permanent reminder that the line between myth and reality can become fatally blurred during times of crisis, and that the costs of such confusion are measured in human lives.